turn in your Bibles to Mark chapter 10, verse 46. So tonight is kind of the end of a section. I would have, like in the contents, I would have said like the first two lessons are part one, then we've been in part two. This would be like the end of part two, and then the last lessons after tonight would be like a part three. So we're going to pivot after tonight from looking at specific Bible characters and how they suffered and how God kind of advanced his mission through them. And we're going to look at more topical stuff. And so I think there's stuff like, if you look in, I think the next one's like discipleship and suffering, maybe something like that. Is that how I worded it? Discipleship defined. Yeah, so you can kind of see where it's going to shift a little bit. So tonight we're looking at Bartimaeus. Who here knows Bartimaeus? Well, I mean, you probably don't know him, he's dead. But, you know. He's been gone a while. You're not old, Joe, but you're not that old. Yeah, all right. So, in Mark's Gospel, at the very beginning, in chapter 1, he starts off and he says, in the beginning, the beginning of the gospel of Jesus Christ, the Son of God. And then he's going to quote, and he says, as it is written in Isaiah the prophet, behold, I send a messenger ahead of you who will prepare your way. So the your is obviously the Lord, so this is going to be Jesus. It's Jesus' way. He's going to prepare Jesus' way, the voice of the one crying in the wilderness, make ready the way of the Lord. So this word way is important in Mark. And so way is like how has the same range as how we have in English. It can mean way, but it can also mean road. They translate it as road sometimes. The word is hodos. And so it'll look differently as you're reading the English, but it's always this word right here, hodos, the way. And so Mark, he portrays Jesus as a suffering servant. Do you remember how Matthew portrays Jesus? King of the Jews. And then Luke, we should know Luke, Sunday morning unless we're sleeping. Perfect man. And John is God. Yeah. And so Mark's take is that Jesus is the suffering servant. And the previous verse right before ours is the key verse. It says, for even the Son of Man did not come to be served, but to serve and to give his life a ransom for many. And so he is the perfect, what Mark is doing with Jesus is he's making him the perfect example of a disciple. If you're a disciple, Jesus is your example. And he's one who humbly serves. So that'll be what we see over and over as we're not going to do it, but if you read Mark, you'll see that over and over. And we saw this last time with the demoniac. In chapter 3, verse 13, he calls the disciples and he appoints them. In verse 14 it says, and he appointed 12 so that they would be with him and that he could send them out to preach. And we saw at the end of the demoniac, what did he want to do after God healed him? Verse 18 it says, he was imploring him that he might accompany him. That's just the English translation of saying that he might be with him. So he appointed disciples that they'd be with him and that he would send them to preach. Here, the demoniac wants to be with Jesus. Same phrase, same wording. And Jesus says, no, you can't come. Go back, tell everyone about what I've done for you. And it says at the end of his story, he went away and began to proclaim or preach in the Decapolis. The Decapolis is what? 10 cities. Decapolis. It wasn't on the quiz, but you did it. So what we see over and over in Mark is because here's Jesus, the example of a disciple, and the disciples, if you pay attention, they just don't get it. They're just like, what? And so what happens is Mark uses unlikely characters to actually get it. So the demoniac is the guy who gets it. He wants to be with Jesus, and he preaches Jesus. So we're going to kind of see that in Bartimaeus' story tonight. And we're going to get there towards the second half of the lesson, but in chapter 8, in verse 17. Jesus, getting on to the disciples, says, do you not see or understand? Do you have a hardened heart? And then on down in the next verse says, do you not remember? And then down in 21 it says, do you not yet understand? See, like the disciples they're with him, but they just don't get it. And I'll kind of tie that in here at the end. But the disciples don't get it, but we're going to see someone who does. And so Bartimaeus, verse 46, chapter 6 says, and they came to Jericho. And as Jesus, was leaving Jericho with his disciples, a large crowd, a blind beggar named Bartimaeus, the son of Timaeus, was sitting by the road. So, Bartimaeus. Who's Bartimaeus? He's a blind beggar. And where do we first see Bartimaeus in the story?
Mark 10:46.
What's he doing?
Begging.
Sitting by the road.
Sitting by the road.
Begging.
Begging. 1 point.
1 point.
Yeah, so it's important. Because how can road also be? He's sitting by the way. So we see him, he's sitting by the hodos. He's sitting by the way. That's your answer, by the way. It's not a blank, but right there. How does the crowd, seeing Jesus, identify him? It's not explicit, but we know because Bartimaeus says he heard. It says, and when he heard that it was Jesus, the Nazarene, he began to cry. So the crowd is saying, there goes Jesus, the Nazarene. And so Bartimaeus, he hears this, and then it says, he began to cry out and say, Jesus, Son of God, have mercy on me. And many were sternly telling him to be quiet, but he kept crying out all the more, Son of David, have mercy on me. So, how does Bartimaeus, who's blind and can't see Jesus, how does he identify Jesus? Son of David. So the people who can see, they have eyes to see, they miss who Jesus is. But Bartimaeus, who's blind physically, he doesn't miss who Jesus is. He calls him Son of David. So he identifies him correctly who Jesus is. So we're already starting to see this kind of contrast, and that's the irony, is that the crowd seeing Jesus was blind spiritually, but the physically blind Bartimaeus could see spiritually. And what was Bartimaeus' plea?
Have mercy.
Have mercy on me. I think JB mentioned this last Sunday. We're in Luke. I think he went there, but he mentioned the parable in Luke 18 of a tax collector and a Pharisee, and they're praying to God. You guys remember this one? Mm-hmm. And what was the plea of the tax collector in that parable?
Have mercy on.
Have mercy on me, I'm a sinner. So you have the Pharisees like, I'm so glad I'm not like this dude. I fast and I pray and I read, and he probably said I have my memory verses in my pocket, and I give to the poor, all this stuff. He's saying, he's basically exalting himself before God. Like, you're so happy with me, God, because I'm so awesome. But then you have the tax collector who knows he's a sinner, who knows he's done bad things. He knows he's scammed and cheated people, and he knows that the only way he's ever gonna see God is if God has mercy. There's nothing he can do. There's no works he can do to earn God's favor, so he pleads for mercy. And it says, Jesus says, I tell you the truth, this man went out of his house justified rather than the other. For everyone who exalts himself will be humbled, but he who humbles himself will be exalted. And so who left justified? The tax collector did, not the Pharisee. So humility is where we get to the place of knowing our need for God's grace and mercy. That's why he says it's harder for a rich man to enter heaven, because the rich man is used to, not that riches keep you from heaven, it's just people who are rich back in the first century were people who, it's kind of like, I don't say you're into yourself, but you look at what all you've done. and you kind of get a big head and you think, I don't need anything. You think of the rich young guy that came to Jesus. What he was wanting when he said he wanted eternal life was he was saying, I want something else for my portfolio. I want something else because I've got it all. I need this next thing. And so the teaching of the day back then was, if you want to inherit eternal life, do a big gesture, like give a ton of money to your favorite charity, something like that. And that will be your work to inherit eternal life. And so that's why Jesus says, why don't you sell all your stuff? And he's like, I can't do it. So, and there's a lot more to this story because they leave out, he says, do this, it's the Ten Commandments, but he leaves out coveting. We're not on that lesson tonight. Anyway, so the idea is humility. Humility is what is the place we need to be in order to understand our need for God's grace and mercy. And so that's why we're going to see Bartimaeus, who suffered humbly. Verse 49, Jesus stopped and said to him, call him here. So they called the blind man, saying, take courage, stand up, he's calling you. And throwing aside his cloak, he jumped up and he came to Jesus. And Jesus answered, in answering him, Jesus said, what do you want me to do for you? And this is important. We do a little hermeneutics tonight. That means Bible study. So what we're doing, I put it there so you don't lose it. It says, Jesus' question is, what do you want me to do for you? And what is his request? He just wants to see. He just wants to see. And so he heals him, and he tells him two things. He says, go, and he tells him that his faith has healed him. And what did he do, that blank there? He followed Jesus. It says in the last verse, it says, go, your faith has made you well or healed you. Immediately, he regained his sight and he began following him. Where?
On the road.
On the road. He's now on the way. He's on his way. So we see where he started. He was by the road. Now he's on the road with Jesus. So what we're going to do now is your Bible's probably like mine, where it breaks it down into sections. So this section started Bartimaeus, where he sees his sight. But it's really connected. And this is what helped me understand the Gospels is they're not these tiny little, he did this, then he did this. It's a story weaved together. And so we're going to see that. So where we're at in the story, and I put it down there, I gave you a little chiasm on your paper there. So we have A, B, and then what we just saw was A prime, right? So blind man, and then you see where there's a story earlier with the blind man. And then you have in the middle here this section, I think it's 8:27 through 10:56?
45.
Oh my. I don't know if that's, I may have wrote that wrong. Anyway, it doesn't matter. That's our section. And so this is an important part of the book of Mark, because this is where it hinges, it turns. So now they're going to go on their way. So if you want, you can flip back to chapter 8, verse 27. It says, Jesus went out along with the disciples to the villages of Caesarea Philippi. Philippi. But I forgot my back hurt. That's good. And it says, and on the way. So now they're on their way. So this phrase, on the way, starts here. So the word's been used throughout Mark, but now the phrase, on the way, begins at 8:27. So they're on their way, and they're going to Jerusalem. That's where they're going. And this section is important right here because I said it's discipleship defined, but there's 3 passion predictions. Do you know what a passion prediction is? A passion prediction is when Jesus predicts his death. So the Passion of Christ, you know the movie back in the day? the passion is his death and resurrection. And so he predicts 3 times in verse 8. In chapter 8, verse 31 is the first one, and then in chapter 9 he does it again in verse 31. And then his third prediction is in chapter 10, and it's verse 33. I was right, it does go through 45. I was thinking 56 because that's this story. This one is. I believe it's 56.
That's 51.
Oh my gosh. Keeping you guys awake. Right? Yep.
That's what their paper says, I don't know.
Yes, no, 52. My paper's wrong. Don't listen to the paper.
52?
52. I'll have to fix that. Yeah, 52. So these are, in this story, this gives us the context for Bartimaeus, is connected to these other stories that were leading up to it. And we see the pivot that now Jesus is on the way, and now who's on the way with him? Bartimaeus. The blind story in chapter 8, verse 22, you guys probably remember this blind guy. This is the gross one. This is not COVID friendly. This is the one where the blind guy comes and Jesus spits, you know? And, let me get there. Yeah, and so, and he says in at the end of 23, he says, do you see anything? In verse 24, he says, he looked up. He says, I see men, for I see them like trees walking around. So he has like unclear, partial, he can't see very well. And so Jesus says, all right, let me give it a second shot, you know? And so he does it, and then he says, he began to see everything clearly. And then how does his story end? Jesus sent him to his home and saying, do not even enter the village, because Jesus brought him out of the village and healed him. So don't go back to the village, go home. So he's not on the way with Jesus. He doesn't go on the way, because Jesus hasn't started his way yet. And then the next verse, now Jesus and his disciples, they go on the way. So I'm just trying to point out that there's a big shift in the gospel that's now aiming towards Jesus on the way to his death. And who does he, going back to chapter 3, who did he appoint? The 12, and they were to do what? Be with him. Okay? So the 12 are supposed to be with him on his way to die. And so he gives the 3 passion predictions, and all the times the disciples never understand. They're like, that sounds bad, but you being king sounds pretty cool. So that's awesome. So we're going to look at the last passion prediction in verse 10, verse 32. It says, and they were what? On the way, going to Jerusalem. So they're on the way, going to Jerusalem. And he says in verse 33, behold, we are going up to Jerusalem, and the Son of Man will be delivered to the chief priests and the scribes, and they will condemn him to death and hand him over to the Gentiles. They will mock him and spit on him and scourge him and kill him, and 3 days later he will rise again. And James and John, the 2 sons of Zebedee, come up to him and say, Teacher, we want you to do for us whatever you ask. Okay, so that takes us back to our fill in the blanks. So James and John, we're going to see, I put the word juxtaposition, that was dumb. I should just say contrast. We're going to see the contrast between Bartimaeus and his very own disciples who are on the way with Jesus. And they say, we want you to do whatever we ask. That's the blank, whatever. But what does Jesus say?
You don't know what you ask.
Before that, what do you want me to do for you? Why is that familiar? It's exactly what he asked Bartimaeus. This is what we call a lexical link. Lexical just means like word, like the lexicon. This is important. I always look for these when I'm studying the Bible. I'm always looking at words, I'm looking at verbs, I'm looking at phrases, and as I read, I'm keeping things in mind, because what especially the Gospels will do, they will link their story through words and phrases. And that's what I'm trying to show you tonight. They were to be with him, they're on the way. But here we see a question that he asked both the disciples and Bartimaeus. And Bartimaeus said, I just want to see. But here, what do they want?
Sit on the left and right.
It says, grant that we may sit one on your right and one on your left in glory. So these are positions of greatness. They're requesting greatness. He just said, I'm going to go to Jerusalem. We're on the way. They're going to treat me horribly, and they're going to kill me. And then I'll come back 2 days later. And they're like, when you're king, can we sit on your right and left? Is that cool? It's like talking to children, I bet. It's like I just said, I'm going to die. It's going to be bad. They're going to spit on me. They're like, well, we like to sit on your right and left. So they're focused on greatness. They're motivated by greatness, not humility. So what's the difference? Bartimaeus humbly requests his sight. James and John arrogantly request power and prestige. So Bartimaeus, at the end of his story, he followed Jesus on the way. As you keep reading, because they get closer to Jerusalem, then they get to Jerusalem, and then what happens? Chapter 14. Jesus is betrayed, right? And the disciples that he specifically appointed to be with him on his way, in verse 50 of chapter 14, it says, and they all left and fled. James and John left him and fled. So they haul tail and get out of there. Jesus is arrested. You know all that stuff. He goes before Pilate in chapter 15. And then they crucify him, starting in verse 22. And in verse 27 it says, they crucified 2 robbers with him, one on his right and one on his left. So who ended up with Jesus, one on his right and one on his left?
The robbers.
The 2 robbers. They're called robbers, but you didn't really crucify robbers. Most likely these were insurrectionists. These were people who were against Rome. So maybe they had stolen stuff from Rome, but they were part of a group that was trying to overthrow Rome. So that's why they're being crucified, as an example. Jesus called James and John to follow him and to be with him. And the disciples, who you think would have got it, they were with Jesus the entire time, on the way to the cross, and they're the ones that left and fled. But you see these other unlikely characters throughout Mark's gospel who want to be with Jesus, and they follow Jesus. James and John didn't understand that suffering precedes glory. That is a big, if it's not a theme in the book, it's definitely a theme in chapters 8 through 10, where it's discipleship defined. Jesus says, you can't be a disciple of mine and have positions of power and prestige in this world. That's not his mode of ruling. It's through servanthood. And that's why he told James and John, he says, if anyone wants to be great among you, he has to be a servant. And so he's trying to help reframe their idea of what it means to have power, and it's through servanthood. So we can talk about suffering preceding glory a little bit more here in a minute, but I always think it's interesting when you look at the Gospels side by side and see the differences. That usually freaks people out because they're like, oh my gosh, I don't know how to answer that. Like, 2 different stories, how can that be? But that's not necessarily what's going on. So I just thought I'd bring this out. It says, why does Matthew's gospel, when he tells the story, he has 2 unnamed beggars? So we don't get Bartimaeus' name in Matthew when he tells the story. We said there's 2 beggars, and that's all we're told. But in what we saw tonight, we see that it's 1 beggar, and it's Bartimaeus. So how would you think, or how would you answer if someone's like, hey, I found a Bible, made a mistake. There's 2 beggars in Matthew, but there's only 1 in Mark. How would you maybe answer that? I'll let you think for a second, you know.
Matthew's interpretation of what he sees
Mm-hmm.
that is different from Mark.
Yeah, so that's always good, is perspective. What are they doing with the stories? And I kind of pointed that out last time with the pigs and Matthew, what he was doing with the demoniac, and then what, because in that one he had 2 demoniacs, and in Mark he only had 1 demoniac also. But I showed you the different words that were in one and not the other, so they were, again, he's using the story to show that Jesus is the Messiah, the King of the Jews, whereas Mark was doing something different. Same kind of thing here. So I think what's going on is, so Matthew was written before Mark. So Mark most likely used Matthew and Luke to do his gospel. So he shared from both, and there's different theories on how all that works. There's even like a mysterious gospel that we don't have called Q, but who knows, it's just a theory. But I think what's going on is, I think, and this could just be me trying to make my point, but I think what's going on is, since Matthew wrote this story first, I think people didn't know who Bartimaeus was. But because he was blind, and that blindness humbled him, his suffering humbled him, to the point where he saw his need for Jesus and cried out for mercy, he was healed, and then his response was to follow Jesus on the way. That's where his story ends. But I think he followed him all the way. I think he was there in Jerusalem. I think after the resurrection, he was a part of the movement. And I think that's when people started like, that's Bartimaeus. That's the guy that was one of the people in Mark's gospel. And so by the time Mark wrote, I think he knew who Bartimaeus was. And so he chose to not include the other beggar and focus in on the one who wanted to be with Jesus and follow him, because it fit kind of his story, how he's trying to show that Jesus has a way, and if you want to be a disciple, then you go with him all the way to the end. So that's my theory. And so the way I kind of tie that in is Bartimaeus' suffering humbled him, preparing him to see and follow Jesus. And it's because Bartimaeus' suffering then preceded his glory. So there's going to be this glory we have at the resurrection, but there's also glory that we can have through our faithfulness in this life. And I think by being put by name in the story, that was Mark's way of giving him kind of recognition, glory, that here's a guy who suffered humbly, that suffering led him to faith in Jesus. He then proclaims who Jesus is. He's faithful to be with Jesus and follow Jesus to the end. And so that suffering that seems like purposeless and meaningless, just sitting in the dirt by the road, begging, and being completely dependent on people's charity or whatever, enduring that, and probably, I guarantee you, day after day, he probably sat there and was like, what did I do to deserve this? I have no point in life. There's no meaning in life. I'm just blind. I can't do anything. I just have to completely just beg for help. But because of him allowing that suffering to teach him humility, because he could have just been mad at God. He could have been mad at everybody. There's a guy homeless out there. I don't know if you've seen him. He's angry at the world, especially citizens of Stillwater. And so he's not letting his suffering teach him humility. He's doing the opposite. He's hardening his heart, and he's angry. So Bartimaeus could have been that guy too, but Bartimaeus is the one who let his suffering humble him. And because of that, that suffering preceded his glory. And that's what Jesus teaches in the 3 passion predictions, chapter 8, chapter 9, chapter 10. That's the theme. He's saying there's no bypassing suffering if you want to be a disciple. If you want to be someone with Jesus, who follows Jesus, then you can't just sidestep the suffering. Look at that move. I feel that later. You can't sidestep, you can't bypass, you can't go around the suffering that comes with being a follower of Jesus. And we're going to see this because I said we're going to pivot into a different kind of thing. And so we're going to look at discipleship and suffering more. That's why Bartimaeus is this guy, because he's going to be our like transition into this more in depth next time. But does that make sense? That Jesus, he says you're to be with me, and he says, Peter's like, oh no, we'll never let that happen. No one's going to kill you. And he says what? Get where? Right. 2 reasons. Why do you think he tells Peter to get behind him? Talking Satan, which is not great.
He's inadvertently, not meaning to, but trying to stop what Jesus is supposed to do.
Right. Because again, he doesn't understand.
Yeah.
Jesus is saying, no, this is the
Not
plan.
intentionally trying to
And he's
stop.
like, no, we don't let that happen. But why does Jesus say, get behind me?
Tell him to follow?
Huh?
Is he telling him to follow him?
Yeah, you can't follow from the front. And Peter's trying to step out, bypass the suffering of the cross, and go straight to glory. And he's saying, you can't do that. Get behind me. That's where disciples belong, behind Jesus. How many times, and I've done this a lot, do I step out, maybe in prayer, and say, excuse me, Jesus, we're not doing this. We're going a different direction. And Jesus is like, no, I mean, you can go that way, but I'm not going with you. Like, this is the way we're going, And so, as a disciple, we can either push against it, or we can have the humility to know he knows best, and wherever he's leading us, he's going to be there with us, just like we'll be with him. And that can bring comfort as he's leading us to places we don't really want to go in life, like the cross. And that's his whole point. He says, if you want to be a disciple of mine, you have to what? Deny yourself. And how do we define suffering at the very beginning of this? Suffering is it's not on the quiz here. We define that suffering is the loss of anything. It could be the loss of comfort, it could be the loss of a loved one, it could be any suffering of the loss of anything, you're suffering, right? So by definition, we're going to talk about this more, as a disciple, to deny yourself, your own interests, and put God's interests above yourself. That's why he says you have to gain your life, you have to lose your life. If you want to experience the life of Christ in you and the joy that comes with that now, then you have to die, metaphorically. Like you deny yourself, your interest, and now you live for him. And so, whether it's a physical death or a death to your own desires and wishes and interests that aren't in line with God's, that's a loss. And so by being a disciple, right away, you have to choose suffering. And that suffering varies from disciple to disciple, right? So we'll get into that, figure out where I'm at on this thing. So how was the mission of God advanced through Bartimaeus' suffering? I'm just going to be quiet, not to be awkward, but I'm not flying through this lesson. So just think about it. Why? Why do you think Bartimaeus, I'm about to read the answer. How was the mission of God advanced? Some of you have the answer. You just shy tonight?
I didn't feel it was right if I said the answer.
Yeah. Make
Well,
everybody
thanks
else
for
think
let-
we got
yeah.
it right in front of us.
Well, that was kind of you all. Helping me out, kill some time. Let the people with the actual blanks squirm. Did you already say this? Am I going to get in trouble?
Suffering and faith got something to do with that answer?
Suffering definitely does. I think it goes back to my theory on why Mark uses Bartimaeus by name, whereas earlier on in the stories and tradition and Mark's gospel, it was just two blind beggars. Bartimaeus wasn't named. I think it's because, or I think how the mission was advanced was that, oh man. Shouldn't have done that. I forgot what. Now it's starting to hurt again. Matthew was written before Mark, like I said. Oh, that's not it. Bartimaeus appears to have become a vocal disciple who was with Jesus and sent to preach. And that's how a better answer now, looking back on it, would be like, It was advanced because he chose to follow Jesus on the way. That would have tied in better word-wise, so you can put that. I don't think that's on the quiz. I think the answer that's on the quiz is Bartimaeus became a vocal disciple who was with Jesus. But I'll give you the answer to that. So I've already previewed, but the next lesson we're going to pivot and look at connections between discipleship and suffering that we've kind of already introduced tonight. And a big theme of that is that suffering precedes glory. For the disciples, it would serving precedes greatness, is what Jesus says. But for disciples, in general, suffering is a part of it. And we can't jump to the glory. We can't bypass the suffering to get there. That we have to follow Jesus' model. Cross first, then glory. There's no glory until after the cross for Jesus, and that's how it is for his followers. So application is the way of Jesus. We're tying in the whole way, starting in chapter 1 of Mark. The way of Jesus is humble servanthood to him and others, not bypassing the suffering that precedes his glory. So we can spend some time on these exercises. So the first one is, how has suffering humbled you in the past? Or in the past, what? I'm glad I caught that. Because you guys are so quiet.
Yeah, are you Yoda?
That's not even close. That you was like 4 letters down. Should be humbled you in the past. So here's my story of how suffering has humbled me recently. I was at the gym today, and I felt the first part where I was doing like a decline. I reached over, grabbed a weight, and I felt it go, and I was like, okay, I'm not young, I'm not stupid, I'm done. So I set it down, slowly get up, just playing it cool, kind of walk around to the front of the thing, because there's a hand, so I like resting on it, put out the vibes, like I'm just in between sets. So I'm like, okay, my back's starting to feel better, I can walk, I can straighten. So I'm like, there's no way I'm gonna ask this buff college guy to carry my weights back to where they belong. Too prideful. So I did not have humility. So I go over and I pick up the first one slowly. And I was like, got it? I'm like walking slowly to the other one. I'm like, all right, I think I'm good. I thought, well, I should just take them one at a time. And then I thought, no, that'll look silly. I'm not gonna do that. The college guy will make fun of me. So I'm like, all right, just slowly go down and pick it up. So I go down and didn't even pick it up. Right as I pulled, that's when the big happened. And that's when I'm bent over like. So I slowly put this weight down on the bench. And I'm like, now I look silly. I am stuck. And so this one's not stable, it's rolling, it's a decline, so it's trying to roll down. So I'm like, first breathe, so I'm breathing, it's not getting better. So I lift it up, so it's now stable, vertical, and I'm leaning on it like, just put out the vibes like you're in between sets. I'm like, all right, this is not a good situation. So I think adrenaline kicked in, didn't want to be embarrassed, so I'm like, okay, finally straightened up, and I walked around to where I was the first time. Like, this worked the first time. So I'm leaning on the thing, like, this is way worse, this is not getting better, it's actually getting worse. I can feel my back just doing whatever backs do there. And so I'm thinking like, forget the weights, how am I gonna get to the car? And I'm like, Heidi cannot carry me out of here. to wheel me out of here? I'm sure there's a wheelchair somewhere. That's embarrassing. So I'm like, okay, I think if I rest on that machine for a few minutes, I might be able to walk out of here. So before I do that, I'm like, I gotta get the weights back. So I had to ask the college guy, in all humility,
You ran in first place.
dude, can you carry my weights? I've hurt my back. He was super kind. He's like, yeah. So he carried my weights, and I'm like,
Sure, Grandpa.
sit down on the row thing machine. I'm like, okay. I'm like, how do I get out of here? Because I'm on the far end. Those doors are here. I'm in the corner here. I gotta walk past everybody. And he's so nice. He comes back when he's done with his reps. He's like, you okay? You gonna be okay? I'm like, I hope so. And I can tell he's the kind of guy, like, if I need to be carried out, he's my friend. He's big enough and he's kind enough. So I get up, and I mentioned earlier, I was like, people probably thought I pooped my pants. I was like, the whole way. And of course, there's nothing but mirrors. You're like, look at yourself. So the lesson, if I would have had the humility to just say, hey, kind college man with muscles, can you, I think I've hurt my back and I don't want to risk it. Can you just go ahead and do this for me? And he would have been like, ah. And then I would have been able to get out of there. And I probably would have just rested, everything would have been fine, but no. Did not have any humility. There's college people around, and I don't want them to think I'm as old as
You are.
I am. So I went and tried to pick up the weights on my own. And so the suffering then pushed me over that ledge to have the humility to ask for help. So that's a way that's a stupid way, by the way. I'm not being like, that's just a dumb way. But it's how it works. Suffering has a really weird way in all of us, no matter how you suffer, whether it's being eating at the gym or something really bad going on in life. Suffering has a way of putting things in perspective and like actually helping us realize our limitations and our actual need and dependence on God. And that we start going through life and we start thinking, we got this, we're good, and God's just kind of the co-pilot, and he's there when we need him, and he loves us, he'll never leave us or forsake us, so we're good. And then we start getting a big head and start forgetting slowly, I think, it's that whole, the frog in a kettle thing, like you don't mean to, but over time, you just start getting a little bit more reliant on your own ability and strength and stuff like that, and then God can just go, here goes your back. Now you have to go straight. Now who are you going to lean on? And so God sent his kind college man. He was an angel. So has there been something like that? I'm sure there has. A time when suffering kind of put things in perspective, kind of knocked you off your high horse, and you're like, you know what? I could do a little bit better job at depending on Jesus as I go through my day. You can tell the story if it's a funny one. I want to hear it. And I think, there's not one reason why God allows suffering, but this is a reason. It's to keep us humble and dependent upon him. And that was a lesson the disciples in the Gospel of Mark just couldn't get. They just couldn't understand what Jesus was doing and why they needed to depend on him, because they didn't get it. When the way actually got to Jerusalem and he said what was going to happen, that's why they took off and ran. That's why they fled. Because they hadn't been humbled to know how much they depend on Jesus. He's not just the guy that feeds them and does some pretty cool magic tricks, He's God. And everything, I don't know if anyone here was at the men's retreat that I taught a couple years ago, but the Saturday lessons I taught on feeding of the 5,000, and that was one of the points was like, and I use Gallagher, like, you know how big Gallagher is? Like, 5,000 people wouldn't fit in Gallagher. Like, you would have to add a whole nother section probably. And then imagine being on half court and just like, let's go to the concession. We're gonna feed all these people. And it's like 2 hot dogs, like 7 bags of potato chips. You know, and we're like, I think we should send them on the way, Jesus. And he's like, no. And he tells the disciples, he didn't say, I'm gonna feed him. He says, you feed him. He tells the disciples to do it, but they hadn't realized their dependence. And so at what point, if you were there and he's like, here's a bunch of hot dogs, and like out of just 2, and now you're loaded up and you are going up those horrible steps at Gallagher. How many times would you go up, come down and get refilled, go up, come back down and get refilled before you would realize everything I need, I get from him? And that was a lesson for the disciples, and that's a lesson for us. Everything we need, we don't do it on our own, we get it from him. He's the source. So when impossible things come up, like feed all these people, the disciples should be like, we got it because you're with us. Everything we need comes from you, and you're with us. And then the other lesson was walking in step. Every step I take, we want to take in step with Jesus. It's the whole equally yoked, not equally yoked thing. Take my yoke upon you. Give you rest. I don't know how I started here. I guess I was going to teach another lesson.
Do you think it was because they had such a different agenda,
Who's they?
the disciples?
Oh.
I mean, they wanted an earthly king. They wanted them to save them, you know.
Yeah, I
Defeat
mean,
the Romans. And
Yeah, so it was like they had their own agenda, and it was so opposite that's why they didn't get what.
yeah, I would say having their own agenda kind of makes them sound worse than they were. I wouldn't say they had their own agenda. They had their own preconceived notion of the Messiah. Just like everybody else had that day. They thought when the Messiah comes, it's the day of the Lord, he's going to destroy the enemies, which would have been Rome, and we're going to enter into the Messianic age. So there's the present age and the age to come. That was the eschatology of the Jews. You know, JB gets up here and he's like, and then we got like, you know, all this stuff, and then we got 1,000 years. That's because we...
Don't pick it up.
I'm not. I don't know if you saw I was like, go get it later. So we can do that because we have progressive revelation. But before Jesus, the Jews, they had the present age, and that's where they all lived, and then they had the age to come. And the age to come was going to come when the Messiah came. So when the Messiah came, kingdom comes, and they move in. And that's what they thought. They thought, we're right here, Jesus is here, and we're headed to Jerusalem, and boom, we're going to move in here. It's going to be glorious, and I'm going to sit on your right, and he will sit on your left, and it's going to be great. So this was the view of the day. It's just like, it wouldn't happen, but because Revelation's closed, but like we have our idea of the end times, right? That I drew up here a minute ago. It's like, what if a prophet came and started saying there's something you've missed that we hadn't seen yet? Because that's how progressive revelation has worked. We'd be like, no, that's not in our timeline. And so we wouldn't be as likely to get it. Maybe we wouldn't shut it out, but we wouldn't understand it fully because it hadn't fully been revealed yet. That's where the disciples are at. So tempted. Nothing like losing a good marker. Don't want it to dry out. So the disciples, they didn't have their own agenda in a sense, like we want our way, not your way, Jesus. It was just, this is what they thought. And I think Jesus was teaching stuff and they just didn't get it. And so they just like, I just default back to what I know and sound like I know what I'm talking about because I don't want to sound like an idiot in front of Jesus. And so I can't really fault the disciples, but that is what hindered their understanding. But at the same time, you're like, you're with Jesus. Bartimaeus is blind and he gets it. You know, the guy filled with the legion of demons, he figured it out. And you guys are with him all the time for 3 years. You think they would get it. And, and Mark is doing something different, so, because he is focusing on what a disciple is, so he's being probably a little harder on the disciples than he needs to, but he's doing it in a literary way to make a point. But they just didn't understand it. Like, you look at Matthew, he's teaching, you get in chapter 13, he starts giving parables of the kingdom, and they're like, I don't know. So, I think it was just new teaching. So like, I don't know if you were at church last Sunday, but it was the new wine in the old wineskin and the new cloth on the old cloth. And it's the same point. Like, Jesus is saying, you have your own traditions of fasting and all these other things you're doing, that how you interpret the law, but your way is wrong. That's why Matthew says, you've heard it said, but I say. So Jesus is coming in. It's not he's changing the law. He's saying, I have the correct interpretation of the law, and this is how you live. Not like this. But they couldn't understand it. That's why at the very end of that section, this is all extra, I'm just teaching. Oh my gosh. Okay. That's why the very last verse says, and no one, after drinking old wine, wishes for new, for he says, the old is good enough. So work it backwards, and you can change that for to a causal because he says. So because he says the old is good enough, he doesn't wish or need or see a need for the new. Jesus is bringing the new, but the Pharisees are good with the old, so they can't see the need. It's also because they're not humble, they're arrogant. They think they have the way of righteousness, and it's through them that people get to God, and so they're already messed up. But that's kind of the point in that whole thing there. Good question. I don't know if I answered it. Yeah. Is there another question? Let's see if I spelled things right here. What does it teach you about yourself and your relationship towards God? It being the suffering that humbles you. And this one, I think we all have some. Does anyone want to share? I'm not going to make you, but does anyone share like a lesson that you learned through a situation or circumstance or a season of life that you learned something about yourself spiritually, but maybe about your relationship with God?
Don't worry about it. Don't worry about it. Don't worry about it.
No.
I get it.
Been there,
No,
done
no,
that.
no,
Somebody help this!
Someone grab that.
This is a good worker!
I'm gonna wait till you're done.
I couldn't wait. I could feel it screaming at me.
In my suffering.
All right, I can focus.
I think in relation to the question, I was just gonna say, I don't have a story, but I was just gonna say that it just tells me that there's always something to learn every day. Even if it's bad, and it's all to help you grow as a person, so.
Well, I think also how you react to suffering or like a situation too. Like regardless, like the outcome is probably going to be the same thing. Like if it's part of his plan, then whether you are making it like the worst possible way possible or looking at the benefits of like what you learn out of the situation, it's going to end up being the same outcome. I don't know if that makes sense.
Correlates with how much faith you
Yeah,
have.
it's
So
like
it's like it is
God-
what it is.
God's gonna get his
like,
way.
Have a good outcome.
God's going to work his will,
What's going on?
and his will be done.
Yeah.
Do you want to be a part of it, or do you want to go kicking
wanna
and
just go
screaming?
hide in a
It's
corner.
like it's like your kid. It's just not your kid, but like anyone's kid. Like when they're real little, it's like this is what we're doing. Like, no. I heard a kid on the elevator. He really wanted his face painted. He's like, I want my face painted. I want my face painted. He just over, and I was like, okay.
Well, see, adults are the same.
The
I want my
mom
face
could have
painted.
I was about to be like, here's a trick. But she figured it out. She got him. She's like, well, what do you want your face to be painted? There's no face painting around anything. So I don't know. He really wanted his face painted. He really did. He was screaming, and she's like, no, we're getting on. We're gonna go into town. And he was like, I want my face painted. It's like, he can go screaming that you want your face painted, but that's not the plan. Mom's gonna do the plan regardless. It'd be helpful for her and you if you stop wanting your face painted.
And everyone else is that.
Yeah, the rest of us within earshot. But yeah, I think you're right. And that's been a lesson that I've learned is like, so I talk about how the disciples wanted to bypass suffering and get to glory. But even when it's like, all right, we're doing this, I didn't get my way, even in suffering, we still try to bypass it. We try to circumvent it. We try to end it at all costs. We try to figure out a way to stop it. And a couple weeks ago, I think, it may have been the last lesson, I can't remember. We talked about the word for endurance, hupomeno. It's a compound word, under and remain. And let endurance have its perfect result, right? That's what James says. And what he's saying is, when suffering comes, consider all joy. How do you consider it joy? It's because you know something. Knowing that the testing of your faith produces endurance. And then when endurance has its perfect result, if you allow it to do its work, meaning if you remain under it for the time that God wants you to endure whatever it is He's bringing you through, you can have joy in that because you know it's going somewhere. It's not meaningless. It's not purposeless. You know that God's got something going on, even though you might not see it. But you suffer long enough, you start to figure it out. Like, all right, here we go again. You got a plan, don't like it, but instead of trying to bypass it and step out and go screaming about your face paint, you say, I'm going to just endure this and do the best that I can to be a witness in my suffering for others, be someone who follows the example of Christ to endure suffering and His faithfulness, and just see what God's got on the other side. And just trusting, that's where faith, and just trusting that it's bigger than you.